Hello, Steeler Nation, and welcome to your SteelerNation.com podcast and first ever SteelerNation.com VidCast. So this is a first for us, and we're having some fun. And today I am joined by nationally renowned sports attorney Dan Lust. And you may have heard him on Fox Sports Radio, ESPN Radio, Sirius XM, and CBS Radio. Welcome, Dan. Dan, it's a pleasure to have you. And where do you currently live and work?
So Greg, I'm in New York. Definitely don't hold that against me. And
Not at all.
For people watching live, I have my black and yellow on here. So I'm in support of Steeler Nation podcast. I work in New York, just outside the city, but my job kind of takes me all over the place. So I love talking about sports. I love going on the radio and analyzing it. My day to day, I'm a civil defense attorney. So when it comes to, like we're going to talk about today, teams possibly getting hit with lawsuits or fans possibly suing, that's the world that I live in. So I'm happy to kind of break that all down.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Excellent. That's the type of things that I wanted to talk to you about. Because before we get into that too, I just wanted to give our fans a little bit of a background on you itself. And I know that you used to work with the New York Giants organization in PR. Can you let Steeler Nation know kind of like what your role was there and what you did for them?
Again, don't hold it against me.
Not at all.
Because I worked for the New York Giants public relations department over about four or five seasons, and essentially the role was to be a liaison between the players and the media. As you can imagine, there is a number of different beat writers that cover the team, from different publications. Some players are going to like certain media members. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes you have to be mindful of players giving too much access to just the media in general. So it was a great job. I did it during college, during law school, at the height of the Giants run. So it was a tremendous experience. And like the New York Giants, the Steelers are a first class organization. So I imagine it probably would have been the same for the Steelers, but PR as well.
That's great. They're family run as well, correct?
Family run as well. And there is obviously ties between the Mara and Rudy families.
Yes, the two royalty families made sure to keep their fiefdoms intact by sealing it with marriage.
It's like the Game of Thrones of football.
It is.
You know what? I got one for you. The game of the red zone. How about that?
There you go.
Take it.
We're going to start that. We're going to roll with that one. So getting into, obviously, as a fan, and we are all really, really in tune with what's going on in sports and really, excited and worried at the same time at the ability for a new season to even occur. So at least from a COVID-19 perspective, I know that safety is an issue. We do know that there are leagues that are starting to come back into working, and the first one being the UFC, which came back on May 9th or May 9th, I believe, or May 10th. And can you talk to us about what the contract was for the UFC and how they were able to get their league going?
Sure. So I think probably one initial note, the UFC obviously came back, but before that we had the WWE, which is, it's, if we're going to call UFC a sport, WWE is pretty, close in that same realm with the amount of, it's when you sign a waiver, it's kind of asking you to assume some risk. That's how the UFC came back and said, if you don't want to fight, you don't have to, and you don't have to sign this waiver. The problem, Greg, when we start talking about the four major sports, it's a little bit trickier to just drop someone out of a card, right? You drop a quarterback off a team, you drop the starting pitcher out of the rotation. It's a very different team construct. Whereas if you just drop one fighter out, nothing really changes. Yeah,
and that's a really great point too. Also, the way that the contract appears to have been written, they obviously had to give up some liability when it comes to getting sick or getting their family sick. I believe that was part of the, disparagement clause within the contract for the UFC, as well as waiving rights for their spouses and families and friends that they live with. Can you talk to us and explain it better than I can, at least what it means, the disparagement clause, as well as the waiver?
Sure. So, there are two separate clauses. The one that you're bringing up here is an anti-disparagement clause, which
Yes.
um, it was revised. Obviously, this time around, the UFC will say that they have anti-disparagement clauses in their previous contracts, but obviously the language was rewritten because they never had to deal with COVID-19 before. So you couldn't speak poorly about the company with respect to their health and safety protocol, and obviously that pertains to COVID-19 for their athletes, for their fans, for coaches, for employees. No one's going to be able to provide a perfectly safe venue, and that's never been the law, right? You can always get hit with a foul ball or a flying puck.
Yeah.
That's never someone's obligation. But it's their jobs to do what's reasonably safe under what's going on. And when it comes to the UFC and the WWE, for better or worse, those guys have now set the table, so to speak, for what is considered reasonable. So even if you're not a UFC fan, you kind of have to be watching this to see what the fan experience is going to be like and what it's going to be like for players.
And that's why I was really excited, because I am a sports fan. I do love the UFC as well. So I was very, very excited when it did return just a few short weeks ago, and got to watch the first match. I thought it was an excellent product that they were able to put on, considering the circumstances that they had to put through. I mean, I've been showing you some footage here as we've been going along, as you've been talking and showing Steeler Nation as we're going along here, but it is
we'll say a tough thing to enforce. But you can imagine, Greg, if you were a famous UFC fighter, let's say you couldn't speak poorly about the UFC, and then your wife was speaking poorly about it. That probably still has the same impact. I mean, just switching sports for a second, I remember this past couple of weeks I've been watching The Last Dance, and Scottie Pippen got a lot of we'll say attention for not the greatest contract in the world. And then Scottie didn't really say anything, but Scottie's wife said, Scotty's doing just fine. So I do understand the logic behind inserting relatives and having them in the contract, but at a certain point, I mean, this contract can't apply to every single person that's in your potential circle. So we'll see if someone in the next couple of weeks, months, wants to test the enforceability of those clauses, but that's what they're dealing with right now.
Okay, great. And looking forward then with the So was there anything specific about the UFC contract which allowed them to start before any other sport? And same thing with the WWE, because you mentioned the WWE did start first, and it's mostly, from what I'm starting to see, is because they don't really have a players union so it's much easier to pass things when it's pretty much like you said earlier, do as we say, or you don't get to fight.
Right. I mean, you're asking what's in the contract that allowed them to proceed. It's really what's not in the contract that's allowing them to proceed, because there is no union, right? Every fighter's kind of on their own, so to speak. In the four major sports, that's, the unions have power. Obviously, baseball is probably regarded as being the strongest, because if you don't do something that the players agree with, you could always stage a lockout, or a strike. But you have the kind of the power of the union, and there is a collectively bargained agreement in the four major sports. UFC doesn't have that. WWE doesn't have that. WWE actually, just for a brief period of having delayed taping, they never really stopped. And that's the luxury you have being a private company. And well, WWE is public, but I mean private with respect to, you don't have to have the wrestlers have to say. So just one kind of, we'll say, breadcrumb that I think has to still be fleshed out in all of sports. Just going into the WWE context in particular, and there's obviously a lot of examples in sports, but just because they're going right now, there's a guy, whoever is familiar with wrestling, Roman Reigns is a cousin of The Rock's. He's one of their big guys. Previously diagnosed with leukemia earlier in his life. He has young children. And Roman Reigns was supposed to be one of the headliners of WrestleMania, supposed to fight, of all guys, I know people will know this name, Bill Goldberg. And Roman Reigns just said he wasn't comfortable fighting because of wrestling, because of COVID-19, young children, leukemia, the combination of factors. So what happened to Roman Reigns? He just dropped out of the show. He hasn't been seen on TV since. Now, again, that might work for wrestling. You can schedule around somebody dropping out. But when it comes to, team sports, it's a little bit different. When it comes to a sport with a contract that runs for a certain amount of years, you're paid a certain amount each year. There's salary cap ramifications. that's the part that's going to get worked out. And especially when you have stars like, James Harden, who has some pre-existing issues, Mike Trout, who's voiced concerns. That's the real concern across the sports landscape.
Now, another interesting thing about WWE that I just remembered is not only since they were able to keep continuing, one of the moves that they made to make sure they could continue was political. And it seemed like they got their sport listed as an essential business to continue to work. So how fair is that they were able to be listed as an essential business? And how politically does that happen so quickly that they were able to be named as an essential business?
So I'm playing devil's advocate because obviously I don't think it's a controversial question. I mean, if you're
Okay.
trying to figure out what's essential, it's, maybe hospitals, maybe law enforcement, maybe electric companies. Wrestling is probably not in the top 5, top 10, maybe a little bit more than that.
Yeah.
The argument. So obviously I don't think there's anything controversial. But when it comes to Florida, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis made the decision. It's one of the first states to do it. I imagine more states are going to follow through with that. But what he said, and you can kind of understand the logic of it. Not necessarily that I agree with it, but I understand it. That what is essential to a particular state is the economy. And to the extent that professional sports can come play in a bubble, be it in Florida, which the NBA is looking at doing right now in Orlando because of Ron DeSantis's order. I can understand how allowing the NBA and all of the players to move down into a bubble in the state of Florida, how that would be essential for the economy. I could see that. So the WWE, whether they were behind it or DeSantis just did it separately, because obviously he's in talks with NASCAR. The UFC event was held in Florida. A combination of those factors allowed Florida to kind of become a very attractive host site for a lot of sports. So was it politically motivated, wrestling being declared essential business? I mean, you can make the argument, but if you're going to say that, the NBA is essential, and I'm sure everyone's very happy that the NBA is moving closer to return, largely because Orlando and Walt Disney World is offering up its space. That's because of Ron DeSantis's decision at the end of the day.
And now we are moving toward team sports opening. So I know internationally, May 10th, we had team sports return in Germany with the Bundesliga reopening that day. Is there something different that they're doing in Germany that they're able to open up a little earlier?
I mean, I guess at the end of the day, right, it comes down to the states actually or the countries, how they're impacted by the pandemic. So we can talk about Germany. Even before that, for the past couple of months, we've had professional baseball being played in Taiwan. Why is that? It's not because of anything they're doing in particular with baseball. They're not wearing masks. That's optional. They just had better preemptive defense when it came to the disease. They were, either aware of it ahead of time, they had masks ahead of time, whatever they did, that just allowed them a lane to operate. So, when it comes to Germany, obviously, the United States overall is one of the leaders in a bad way on the pandemic front in terms of the amount of exposures, amount of positive tests. So we're a little bit behind the 8 ball in that sense. But in a kind of, we'll say, silver lining, United States has the ability to kind of sit back from a liability perspective and see how these leagues and teams across the country, across the world, are dealing with it ahead of time. So they're not going to be, we'll say, the guinea pig in this, COVID situation.
And are you familiar at least with the Bundesliga? Are they doing it in just a few cities, or have they opened it up pretty much the whole country?
So my understanding is that they're playing in empty arenas. That it's the same type of situation. There's no fans. The one piece of interesting note that came across my feed. So the Bundesliga is not allowing obviously fans in the stadiums. That's I think only restricted to I think Taiwan's doing it. I think Korea might be doing it soon, but it's not happening in Germany yet. But what they are not allowing, which just mindful for Steeler Nation, the Bundesliga is not allowing fans to congregate outside the stadium either. You can imagine for football games, maybe you're not allowed in, but maybe you had a thought that you'd like to tailgate outside and just sit in the parking lot. The Bundesliga started hearing reports that fans were going to try to, celebrate outside with other people, and the German government made an announcement that the police would be ready to enforce these rules that fans would not be allowed to be outside. So you can imagine when it comes to football. I'm seeing the same stuff. I'm sure everyone on your that's listening now, these different protests at gyms across the country and different public gatherings. Now, imagine if there is a football game played in an empty stadium anywhere in this country. it's almost a virtual certainty that people will try to show up.
Yes.
And imagine the police being called on your own fans. It's just that's the reality that the Bundesliga is dealing with right now, and one that I don't think is so far fetched here domestically.
Yeah, and I think that compares, like you're saying, more apples to apples for football. But at least as a football enthusiast, I'm looking at the Bundesliga, seeing that they're able to operate successfully thus far for the past 3 weeks, and it gives me, as a football fan, hope that I'm going to see some football this year. I also know that the NHL has just announced a 24-team format. Came out last night, where they're trying to determine on 2 host cities to play the playoffs. Essentially, they've got 16 teams playing in, and then they play into the 4 teams on each side that have a bye. How does this work then has the NFLPA or the NHLPA agreed to this yet, or is this still the NHL's proposal?
So for Steeler Nation, I'm sure there's a lot of crossover with Penguins Nation. Is that what we'll call it?
A lot of Penguins fans here.
So yeah, the NHLPA, the news was on Friday that the NHLPA agreed to a 24-team playoff. So it wasn't necessarily set in stone that it would happen, but they agreed to it in principle. The news yesterday was that the NHL signed off on it. So we now know, don't everyone get ready and get ready to go to the games. There's still a lot of hurdles to get through, but we now know at a minimum, if and when the NHL returns, it will be in a 24 playoff system. There's a lot to break down in terms of how the NHL draft lottery is going to be affected, among other things. But what you do have to keep in mind is that it's only one of several hurdles. And Greg, as you pointed out, they still haven't figured out where these games are going to be played, if they're going to be played in any one of a number of hub cities they're considering. Some, mind you, are in Canada, which is still dealing with different governmental restrictions for travel. And the other part of it, the really tough one, and probably, I imagine no easy answers as we're talking about now, is an agreed upon health and safety protocol for return. So I imagine venues are going to be easier than health and safety protocol, but you're still going to have, at the end of the day, health and safety protocol discussions, and then obviously the financial conversation as to how much do I need to be paid to take on the risk of playing hockey. So definitely not an easy decision, but there's a lot more hurdles to pass.
So is this also going to be a condition if they're playing in 2 host cities? Is this going to be, an instance where NHL players are essentially being deployed for a month to 2 months away from their families, not able to come back? Is it supposed to be like an isolation type return?
That's my understanding. I'm not sure the specifics of the NHL, but I know the MLB and NBA were both having a conversation about whether or not to put families in this bubble in some way, so that the players wouldn't be away from their families for an extended period of time. But I think that's the general understanding, is that for the duration of the Eastern Conference playoff on the one hand and the Western Conference, these 2 sites would be completely separate. And then, just because at least in Canada right now, if you cross the border into Canada, you have to have a 14-day period of quarantine. So, I just think practically, if your team gets eliminated early, you probably can leave the bubble, just thinking logically. But then at the end of the day, if you have to cross the border, one team has to go into a different bubble for the Stanley Cup Finals, obviously East versus West. There's going to have to be a merging of the bubbles at some point.
And now that they have a plan, at least for the NHL, it seems like the NBA would be a little bit more difficult to get together. So how much tougher is it to open the NBA over the NHL?
So the issues that I was mentioning in terms of health and safety protocol, salary reductions, venue, those are the same conversations between the NHL and NBA. So the NHL hasn't figured those 3 things out. They have figured out gameplay. From a, when it comes to the NBA, I've been trying to be vocal about this on Twitter. It's a little difficult for the NBA, because for the NHL, what they basically did is they found a very clean cutoff point in the standings. The top 24 teams just so happened, Greg, to all be at or above 500. So it made for a very easy break. And the bottom 7 teams all below 500. So guess what? If you weren't 500 at this point, you don't get to make the playoffs. So you could buy that. The problem in the NBA, if you just look at the schedule right now, shockingly, and I saw this yesterday, 17 teams in the NBA out of 30 are currently under 500, including some top 8 seeds. So if you were to cut off, right, if you have a 24 team playoff in the NBA, which is on the table, which Commissioner Adam Silver sent a proposal to all 30 GMs. This is one of the concepts of play-in tournament where you'd have 9 versus 12, 10 versus 11, then you'd get into the bracket. But
Yeah.
the problem is, Greg, even if you do that, where do you cut off the bottom 6? I mean, they're all lottery teams. They're all like, my New York Knicks are going to be in the playoffs, and they'd have to potentially give up a spot in the lottery to get busted out in the first round. I mean,
Wow.
it's not such an easy selling point. So I think, when it comes to the NBA, you'd love if they could just copy what the NHL did and just move forward, but not as easy.
So another aspect or league or organization that I think that would be even harder to open, which, Steeler Nation has a lot of interest in college football, and that's the amateur sports of the NCAA. So are there any plans on the table currently for the NCAA to regain any type of competition this upcoming year?
So, the short answer is yes. I mean, there are some plans in the works. The issue, and we haven't spoken much about baseball, Greg, but the comments of Blake Snell have been Blake Snell, former Cy Young winner on the Tampa Bay Rays. His comments got a lot of, public interest. But he said something interesting. He said, when you're a professional athlete, the risk is through the roof, and he doesn't want to be paid a reduced salary to come back and play baseball. Now, Greg, you asked me about college sports. I don't mean to pop quiz you here. Do you know how much college athletes are being paid to play during COVID-19? Zero. Greg, that was great. I'm not sure how you knew the answer to that. $0. So that's the PR look. You can have these pros fighting over millions of dollars, but at the end of the day, it's a very tough sell to tell these athletes to pay to play for, to take on all the risk with such little reward. And then, Greg, mind you, for years, the reason that athletes got away without being paid is because they were given a free education on the other end of it. And that was always the bargain for exchange. That was how the NCAA got away with it. But school's not in session right now, right? You have these to be determined Zoom classes, which no one's in love with. So if you're going to suspend school, and there's not going to be classes, you can't really have these football players masquerading around as pros when they're not getting paid anything.
And that's interesting because it seems like all of the colleges are moving toward being the University of Phoenix, being online. But what you mentioned, what you touched upon is, I think this might be the instance where you actually get true traction for college athletes being able to be paid for competition, because before, like you're saying, it's a fair exchange, getting a free education, free room and board, everything else to play sports. But now you're risking your life and possibly the health of you and loved ones for attracting COVID-19. So I think that this might be an actual launching point for college players being played. And how do you feel about that?
You'd hope it's a launching point, but there's been several launching points over the course of time, and nothing has really moved the needle. But the news before COVID-19 hit, obviously the name, image, and likeness report had come out several weeks ago. So there's progress being made, but on a larger sports scale. The question is, is it now too late for the NCAA, because there's already these pipelines for top talent, specifically in the college basketball landscape, to skip college basketball and go either play in Australia, as 2 top pros did this year, and they're going to be top picks in the draft. It's RJ Hampton and LaMelo Ball. But even this most recent cycle, 4 top players, instead of going to play in college, they're going straight to the NBA's G League to get paid low 6 figures. And guess what? They're going to get paid at least something to deal with that risk. So that's just something to be mindful of. I know Florida has the earliest state legislation that's going to allow athletes to get paid. That's the summer of 2021. So I think that's the loose deadline for the NCAA to figure it out. But, obviously they have a lot of things on their hands right now to deal with the liability. So I imagine, paying athletes gets put on the back burner, so to speak.
And once you're paying athletes, is it only for specific sports, or is it going to be open for all NCAA sports?
So you're not paying, like the school is not going to pay athletes or anything like that. What I've kind of described, at least what it looks like we're going to get. The other shoe is still to drop as to, we just know what the recommendations look like. We know what fair pay to play in California look like. It's, if you want to call it this, it's kind of like an entrepreneurship license. to the extent that you can make money off of your name, image, and likeness, you're given the ability to do so. The NCAA named this NCAA report, these recommendations, they mentioned that before they were formally adopted, that the NCAA was going to look at guardrails to put in place to make sure these, the amount of money you're making wouldn't get crazy, or you wouldn't look like a professional athlete. So, there's no word on it, but if the NCAA ended up instituting like a cap of how much money you could make for a given year, that wouldn't shock me. So yeah, no one is necessarily getting paid. Like if you're a women's swimmer, you could if you were an Olympian, right, you could still make probably more money than maybe like the backup offensive tackle, for the Pittsburgh Panthers. But like, it's still up in the air. But yeah, I do think that this does bring a lot of attention to the fact that for college to return, right, these athletes, these young kids are taking on the risk, even though statistics kind of bear out that if you're 20 years old, you're less likely to get it. You're still taking on risk, and there's no financial reward.
Yeah. And now that sports, theoretically could return, the question has always been, will there be fans? Will there not be fans? So if fans are going to be part of this process, should fans expect having to sign a waiver to attend a game?
I think what's kind of, again, coming to the spotlight, for years, we've attended games. I've attended my fair share of games. If you ever look at the back of your physical ticket, you are waiving some rights and obligations. Just if you look at the back of your ticket, it'll say, it's really small, tiny print. You don't read it, just like nobody reads the iTunes discretions when you buy anything. No one reads them. But, just like we're talking about getting hit in the head with a foul ball or a flying puck, you're agreeing to certain, certain known risks that you're assuming the risk of certain things happening. When it comes to COVID-19, there's a question as whether you can assume risks that you don't know about. And that's why, historically, it makes sense to have a waiver, to put that in writing, to make the font on the ticket a little bit bigger so people know what they're signing up for. But you guys in Steeler Nation made some news recently with this the season with the ticket and the seating plan that only selling out half of seats. So you guys are the first to do it. So I'm curious to see how that works out.
And that's something I wanted to touch upon as well, because over here on Steeler Nation we have an article written by Beth Ruzanik, and she was looking for ways that the Steelers are looking to protect season ticket holders. I know they've moved back the date from May 1st deadline to June 1st deadline. And some teams are doing an option to skip the season and retain your tickets. So obviously, because a lot of people have lost their jobs, you can't work during this time as a fan. You still don't want to lose the season ticket opportunity that your family's had in their family for generations in some of these teams. And so they're saying they would credit money toward next year's costs currently, but how does it look for teams to be able to make this offer for fans to say you can skip this year and we're not going to take away the rights to your season tickets or your PSLs?
So I guess I've said this, and everyone can say it. When you want to say it, the new normal, you want to say uncharted territory. I think it's kind of just takes creative problem solving, just like you saw the NHL come to terms in this 2014 playoff. Obviously, it's never been done before, so they had to make it up on their own. When it comes to certain teams, right, be it the Steelers have a very different ticket situation than we'll say the Los Angeles Chargers, who don't have the same type of fan base, don't have the guaranteed season tickets. Probably you guys are closer to like Green Bay, where it's we'll say standing room only. It's probably the best way. But I understand the logic of trying to be able to defer season tickets for a year from if you're the fans, and I understand if you're the teams trying to lock in as much guaranteed revenue as you can, because I've been following this across all sports. Obviously, the salary caps in these four major sports are dependent on the amount of revenue that each team brings in across the league. So I know Adam Schefter has been very vocal about it. The NFL overall stands to lose, tens of millions of dollars, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, from the lack of fans being in the stands and that gate revenue. And where that impact is felt is on the salary cap, which has not just impacts on, us watching like the UFC with no fans in the stands. Who cares, right? I don't really care if I'm watching with fans or not fans, but I do care if for athletes, all the salaries end up getting dropped out, or if some team has a 100 million committed in salaries, all of a sudden if the salary cap drops to 75, what happens? Teams can't just be operating at a loss and then we're in fear of the underpinning of the actual sport, the actual team, and then then we have to worry about the actual stability of the sport, which is a little scarier. So I do understand the logic. I think, Greg, there's one interesting note that we haven't touched upon, but I know just in this world where teams are trying to mitigate the risk as best as possible, one option that's been discussed is removing certain seats from the stands so that fans can have an easier ability to social distance. So, for example, if you had a row of 8 seats, you would remove the 2 rows in front of you, the 2 rows behind you, and we'll say a couple seats to the side. And that's what's called Lux seating. Just maybe a safer way to watch a game. Maybe let's be glass half full. More leg room. You don't have to have someone dropping beer down your neck,
Right.
which has happened to me before.
Yeah.
But you have to keep in mind that if you do something like that, you have to leave yourself the wiggle room, because if you have less seats, maybe you need to charge more for those seats to account for the revenue. So again, I see it both ways. I understand the fans' perspective. I understand the team's perspective, but you can't anger your fans, right? You can't bite your nose to spite your face. So it's definitely an interesting battle to watch.
So as a quick aside, since the leagues would be losing money for the people coming into the stadiums now, does that give them more power to negotiate larger contracts for these television contracts, which seem to be the only seat in the house now?
I mean, it depends whose perspective you're in. Does it give you more leverage? Sure. If you are a television network, most of these deals are locked in for a number of years, right? If you are them, the same like we're seeing in Major League Baseball right now, the deal was negotiated in Major League Baseball. I mean, just from the Players Association's perspective, they took reductions on their contract, and now they're, Major League Baseball, the owners want to come back to the table and renegotiate further reductions because they didn't take into account that there couldn't be fans. So if you're a Fox, if you were an ABC, if you're any of the, if you're TBS, any station with a major network, what are you going to say? Hey, we already came to terms in the deal. What right does it give you the ability to renegotiate it? Nothing has changed. We're providing all the broadcasts. We're providing all of our employees. We're providing the trucks, all the cameras. We can do this. The fact that there are going to be more eyeballs on it, if I'm, a television network, I would say it doesn't give you the right to necessarily renegotiate it. But there's obviously additional revenue, different ad space that can be bought. So you'd expect these teams and these leagues to make more revenue overall. But I know it's unclear if it actually gives you the right to renegotiate these long-term terms, which obviously it's good for us to be able to watch it, but not necessarily great for the teams if all the money is being poured into television and nobody's actually coming to watch them.
And now we've reached the point of the podcast / VidCast where we have questions from Steeler Nation. So our Steeler Nation members log on, and they ask questions directly for our participants here that within our podcast, so we can ask you direct questions. So Dan, you're getting your first question from /Steel, and he says, I have tickets to the Hall of Fame game. How do you see that shaking out? Would he be able to watch the Hall of Fame game, being the first preseason game played for the NFL season?
Watch in person, I imagine he's saying.
Yeah,
right?
he has tickets to watch it in person, correct?
I guess I think it's probably right around late August, right? I imagine that's when it is, somewhere right around there. So yeah, I mean, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news. I'm just looking across the sports landscape and where all these dates that leagues are talking about. I mean, you're seeing in the, football doesn't have, and fortunately for football, they don't have to have this conversation yet. They can watch the other 3 majors figure this out, and then football can jump in. But when it comes to just, for the question, I know Commissioner Adam Silver in basketball has said that we are anticipating potentially having no fans into the year 2021. Doesn't mean the entire year of 2021, but January, February, you can imagine where that would go. So, as much as I would I love to go to a game now? Would I love to, take my family to a game? Sure. But just the timelines that you're getting from the leagues that are in the middle of this and trying to deal with it, they're kind of pointing toward best case scenario, really the end of 2020, but they're definitely open to the understanding that it could be also 2021.
Another question from Drink Iron City states, Dan, as a legal guy, do you see any fans trying to take the NFL to court if they can prove COVID-19 exposure by going to a game?
I like the term legal guy. I think I'm going to go with that.
There you go.
So yeah, I think it's important to note, right? Like in our country, you could sue anyone for anything. It's another question as to whether or not you can actually win that lawsuit. So I did a lot of media, Greg, right when the Rudy Gobert thing happened in basketball. You know, if to the extent there was a breakout, and let's say Rudy Gobert infected all, Rudy Gobert, for those who don't know, he's on the Utah Jazz. He's a big center. The day before it came out that he had COVID, he was touching all these microphones, and I guess he described as being careless in a locker room. So people ask, "Oh, careless? That sounds a lot like negligence. Could you file a lawsuit against Rudy Gobert?" So the question is, yes, you could always file a lawsuit, but when it comes to COVID-19 in particular and proving negligence, first you have to prove that someone was careless, which for Rudy Gobert he admitted he was. Now let's go back to the NFL context. Again, if you allow fans to come in, you're not necessarily being careless. You have to do it in a reasonably safe way. The question of whether or not is careless is kind of up for debate. Rudy Gobert admitted that he was careless, so he didn't have that discussion there. Now, going back to Rudy Gobert, what the harder part in terms of winning that lawsuit was proving something called causation, that Rudy Gobert's actions were the proximate cause, were the direct cause of someone getting COVID-19. In the Rudy Gobert context, how is someone logically going to prove that and only that was the reason that they got COVID-19? Not the trip to Whole Foods, not the trip to CVS, not the trip to the McDonald's drive-through. It was that. So causation is the very hard element for an athlete to prove, and also for a fan to prove, because in your daily life, just imagine all the different things. If I'm an attorney on the side, all the other things you're touching, you went to go to the mailbox, you went to walk your dog. Causation is going to be very hard to prove at the end of the day. But that's the fear of these leagues, that they'll just get hit with a bunch of lawsuits and have to spend the money to defend them. Even if they might win, there is terrible PR that comes with even just getting hit with a lawsuit.
And thank you very much for joining us on the SteelerNation.com podcast and SteelerNation.com VidCast, Dan. We really appreciate you taking your time out of your day, because we took a lot of it, and I do appreciate it. So now you can add the Steeler Nation network to your list of other networks you've been in for nationwide distribution. So thank you very much, Dan.
My absolute pleasure. And if anyone wants to follow me, again, I'm on Twitter at SportsLawLust and also Instagram, SportsLawLust.
Perfect. Yes, I was going to state that as well. And that is at SportsLawlust on both Twitter and Instagram. Guys, follow Dan. He knows his stuff. He really does. And he gets into a lot of topics and a lot of every single league, and he's in the know on all the main stuff that's happening. So it's really interesting to follow his Twitter and his Instagram as well. So Steeler Nation, come on over to the SteelerNation.com for the best original Steeler news on the internet. Be sure to join us on our football forum for excellent football discussions. Also, you got to check out our gear page, guys, and I'm going to quickly show you how to navigate the gear page. And that is here. No, I just lost this one. Great. All right, no, I'm not. So that's the part of the technical difficulties of the first time doing a share screen on a vidcast. But we do appreciate it. Check out the gear page for the best Steeler Nation tailgate wear. Be sure to subscribe to the Steeler Nation channel on YouTube so you can watch these vidcasts and podcasts live as they're happening. You can make some comments there in the comment section so you can ask questions as we're occurring. And thank you, as always, for joining us on your SteelerNation.com podcast and the first SteelerNation.com vidcast. I'm your host, G.Stryker, with Dan Lust, rooting along with you, as always. Go Steelers!
Thanks, Greg.
You're very welcome. And we're done. So I got it all. And I'll pop
that was good.